They didn't tell me it would feel like a funeral. Not the kind with flowers and prayers and the sound of organ keys, but the quieter kind, surprise, where something is buried and no one even bothers to mark the spot. The morning they moved me in, the air outside was cool and damp, surprise. That in-between season where Spokane can't decide if it's spring or winter, my suitcase, one old leather carry-on I'd owned since Linda and I took our trip to Yellowstone, sat by the front door. Surprise, Michael was in the kitchen, tapping his phone, his coffee growing cold in the mug I'd bought him for Father's Day 15 years ago. Surprise, the one that said world's best dad. I'd given it as a joke back then. Now it felt like a bad prophecy. Stephanie didn't come downstairs. I could hear her footsteps overhead. Surprise, the muffled slam of a dresser drawer. We should get going, Michael said without looking at me. The intake appointment's at 10. Intake. Like I was a package being processed. Surprised, I wanted to ask him why. Why now? Why at all? I still drove, I still cooked for myself. My knees weren't perfect, but they'd carried me through decades of construction work and could damn well handle another flight of stairs. Instead, I said nothing. You learn after enough years of loving people, that sometimes silence is the only way to keep your dignity. The drive took 20 minutes. I watched the city roll by. The diner where Linda and I used to split pancakes. The hardware store where I bought the hammer I still keep. The park where Michael learned to ride his bike. None of these places knew they were saying goodbye to me. Surprise. When we pulled up to South Hills Residential Care, the building looked fine. Not fancy. Not run down. The kind of beige box that could be a dentist's office, a church hall, or a waiting room for the end of your life. Inside, a woman with a name tag that read Karen, Senior Care Coordinator, greeted us with a smile that had the warmth of a thermostat setting. Room 217. End of the hall. It's one of our quiet ones. You'll like it there. Quiet? That word stuck to me like lint. She showed me a small rectangle of a room, single bed with a metal frame. A nightstand with a drawer that didn't close all the way and a window that looked out at a brick wall. Beige walls. Beige curtains. Beige, beige, beige. Nice and quiet, she said again. If that was a gift. Michael lingered in the doorway, phone still in his hand. I've got a meeting, Dad, but I'll check in later this week. I nodded. He left. The sound of his shoes on the tile faded, then the front door clicked shut. That was the last sound I heard for hours. I sat on the bed and ran my hand over the thin blanket. Thought about the quilt Linda made the year Michael was born, each square a patch from an old shirt or dress. She would have hated this place. Hated how it smelled faintly of disinfectant and boiled carrots. Hated the quiet that felt less like peace and more like absence. But mostly, she would have hated that I was here while our son was still making mortgage payments with my money. I was paying for the roof over his head while mine was a rented ceiling in a place where people came to wait for the inevitable. And I thought if she were here, this wouldn't be happening. The photo that changed the air 3 weeks in my stay, the air in room 270 still smelled like someone else's life. Not bad, just not mine. Karen, the care coordinator, had shown me how to use the community room's shared computer. So you can play online games or check your email, she said brightly, like she was offering a cruise ticket. Most days I ignored it, but one Tuesday morning I wandered in after breakfast. There were 3 other residents there. 2 men half dozing in front of a muted television, and Edna, a retired librarian. Typing so slowly it felt like the keyboard might lose patience. On the table by the window sat a copy of the Spokane Chronicle, folded open to the sports section. I picked it up, surprised, but my eyes kept drifting to the idle computer screen, the Facebook login page glowing faintly. I hadn't been on Facebook in months. Linda used to keep up with everyone. Old friends, cousins, even the kid who'd lived next door in '86. After she passed, the point of it seemed to fade. But that morning, for reasons I can't explain, I signed in. The first thing I saw was my son's grin. Michael stood in front of a gleaming white Mercedes E-Class, one arm draped around Stephanie, the other holding the key fob like a prize. The caption read, "Living the Dream." "Thanks, Dad." I stared at the words. At first I thought maybe he meant something sentimental, that I'd raised him to dream big, or some hallmark sentiment like that. But then my gaze fell to the comments. "Surprise, sweet ride, finally upgraded, well-deserved, man." And then one from Stephanie's cousin. "Hope your dad doesn't mind helping you into the fast lane." My chest tightened. I left the computer and walked straight to Karen's desk. "Can you print something for me?" I asked. She smiled. "Sure." "What do you need?" "My last 3 credit card statements." Her eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't ask questions. 10 minutes later, I sat on my bed with 3 sheets of paper. Prize, each transaction like a breadcrumb in a trail I hadn't wanted to follow. There it was, 8 to 600. 3 transfers over 10 days, straight to a dealership I recognized from their TV ads. Surprise. The math was cruel in its precision. Exactly the down payment on that Mercedes. I didn't yell. Didn't crumple the paper, didn't march to Michael's office. Instead, I sat with it. Prize. Let the weight of it settle in my chest, cold and heavy. Linda and I had spent 40 years building our retirement. Not lavishly, just carefully. She clipped coupons. I took extra shifts. Surprise. We bought used cars, fixed our own appliances, patched our own roof. We put money aside for someday. Someday wasn't supposed to look like this. Surprise. Someday wasn't supposed to be me in a beige room while my son drove leather seats and Bluetooth steering bought with my someday fund. And the worst part, he hadn't even hidden it. That night, Prize, I couldn't sleep. The hall was quiet except for the faint hum of the vending machine outside my door. Surprise, I pulled open the drawer of my nightstand and found the black leather notebook Linda had given me on our 40th anniversary. She'd said, Prize, write the things you can't say out loud. I flipped to a blank page and wrote, slowly today I learned the price of a son's dream. 600 down, and 40 years of trust. The next morning, Prize, I woke before the sun. The hall outside my door was dim, the overhead lights still set to night mode, casting everything in a pale blue wash. Prize, I dressed in the same pair of worn jeans I'd brought from the house and slipped the notebook into my back pocket. By 7, I was on the payphone in the lobby. Prize, few people use it anymore. Most residents rely on their cell phones, but mine stayed in a drawer turned off. Too many calls that weren't really for me. Just for what I could give. Prize, I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Harold Whitman, came the familiar voice. Even at 71, Harold's tone still had the solidity of poured concrete. It's Dennis, I said. Prize, I need to talk. Harold had been my friend since we were both 20-somethings in tool belts, hammering siding in the summer heat. He'd traded the carpenter's apron for a law degree. Prize, but he never lost the way of speaking in measurements and straight lines. We met that afternoon at a coffee shop near the courthouse. He took one look at me and said, Prize, tell me everything. I slid the printouts across the table, watched his jaw tighten as he scanned the numbers. That's your retirement, he said, not asking. I nodded. Prize, you want it back. I want it to stop, I replied. And I want a record. Something official. Something that says I'm done being their bank. By the time I left the coffee shop, Surprise, Harold had drawn up the paperwork to cancel every automatic transfer to Michael's mortgage. Prize, my signature felt like more than ink. It felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd given away without realizing. It was almost too easy. No confrontation, no shouting match, just a form, a signature. Prize, the quiet satisfaction of closing a door they'd assumed would always be open. Back in room 217, I pulled the notebook from my pocket and wrote again, the first nail is pulled. The structure will shift. Prize. They won't notice at first, but they will feel it. In the days that followed, I played my part. Spoke to Michael on the phone when he called. Listened as he talked about work. Prize. About how tight things were, how the kids were doing. I didn't mention the transfer. I didn't mention the Mercedes. But at night I gathered bank statements, old receipts, Prize. Even photographs, like the one of Stephanie standing in front of the new granite countertops I'd paid for when their old kitchen just didn't work for entertaining. Each page went into a manila folder. Surprised, the weight of it growing a little heavier each evening. It wasn't anger driving me, not anymore. It was something colder, cleaner, the need to set the record straight. For them, for me, for Linda. Prize. The last piece fell into place one rainy Tuesday when Harold called. You ever think about what you want to do with the money you've got left? He asked. I hadn't, not really. Prize. Because if you're serious about being done with them, he continued, you could do something that matters, something for you. That night, sitting by the window in the dim light of my little lamp, Prize, I thought about Linda, about her love for community, the way she always made room at our table for the neighbor who'd lost a spouse, or the kid from down the block whose parents forgot his birthday. Prize, by morning, the idea had a name, Linda's Porch. Within 2 months, the plan was in motion. A small storefront on 5th and Elm, paint peeling but bones still good. Harold helped with the leaves. Prize, spent the afternoon sanding the floors myself, the scent of wood dust waking up a part of me I'd missed. The porch would be for people like me. Not just fathers, Prize, but anyone left behind by the family they built. A place to work with your hands to remember you could still make something worth keeping. I didn't tell Michael, not yet. Instead, Prize, I let the silence between us grow, filling it with the sound of saws and sandpaper, the steady rhythm of nails finding home in wood. And one evening, as I locked up after finishing the first workbench, I realized I hadn't thought about the Mercedes in days. It was just a car. But this was a foundation. I used to think that revenge had to be loud, slamming doors, pointed words, dramatic exits. But sometimes the real turning point is quiet, a line you cross alone without witnesses, knowing you'll never step back. That's what Room 217 became for me. Not a place of exile, but the place I learned to move in silence, to build something in the open air while they weren't looking. Linda used to say you can tell a lot about a person by what they build when no one's watching. I was finally building something for me, and they wouldn't see it coming until the walls were already up. The picture everyone saw but me. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely arrives with a warning. It doesn't knock first, it slips in like a draft under the door. You don't notice until you feel the cold. I'd been in room 217 for 3 weeks when it happened. Long enough to know which nurses liked to linger for small talk. Long enough to tell the difference between the hum of the vending machine and the whine of the elevator motor. Long enough to convince myself that this arrangement, while humiliating, might at least be temporary. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the clouds hang low and the air smells faintly of rain. I wandered into the common room after breakfast, more out of habit than desire. Edna, the librarian down the hall, was at the shared computer, pecking away at the keyboard like she was trying not to hurt it. The TV murmured in the background, tuned to a morning show about holiday recipes. I was halfway to the coffee pot when Edna said, "You should check your Facebook, Dennis." There's a picture you'll want to see. I almost didn't. I hadn't logged in for months, maybe a year. Linda was the one who kept up with birthdays and baby photos. After she died, Facebook felt like an empty porch swing, something you could sit on, but it didn't go anywhere. But curiosity has a way of poking at you. I took her seat when she left for her Tai Chi class. Typed in my password and waited. And there it was, the first post on my feed. Michael, my son, standing in front of a gleaming white Mercedes. Stephanie by his side, both of them beaming. Was holding the keys up like a fisherman showing off a trophy catch. The caption was short, "Living the dream. Thanks, Dad." At first, I thought maybe it was a joke. The kind of sarcastic thing people say when they buy something expensive, as if to say, I know it's over the top. But then I scrolled through the comments. Sweet ride! Finally upgraded, man. Hope your dad doesn't mind. From Stephanie's cousin, they weren't laughing at the absurdity. They were admiring it. Admiring what my savings had bought them. I felt the same kind of stillness I'd felt at Linda's funeral. Like the world had gone silent just long enough for me to hear my own breathing. I walked straight to Karen's desk. "Do you think you could print something for me?" I asked. She glanced up from her paperwork. "Of course." "What do you need?" "My last 3 credit card statements." Her eyes flickered just for a moment, but she nodded. "Give me 10 minutes. Back in my room." I spread the papers across the bed like a dealer laying out a losing hand. There it was, 8,600. 3 transfers over 10 days to a dealership whose logo I knew from the television. I'd seen enough auto ads in my life to know exactly what that number meant. A down payment, Linda's and my someday fund. The money we'd earmarked for a road trip through New England in the fall. For visits to the kids if they moved away, for a roof repair if we needed it, was now sitting in a driveway with leather seats and Bluetooth steering. I didn't slam the papers down. Didn't storm out. I just sat there. It wasn't the money itself that hollowed me out. It was the knowledge that they didn't even think I'd notice. That in their minds I was already too old, too slow, too irrelevant to catch it. And in a way, they were right. If not for Edna and her curious Facebook browsing, I might have never known. That night, I pulled out the black leather notebook Linda had given me on our 40th anniversary. She'd told me to write the things you can't say out loud. I started a ledger. Page 1, the Mercedes, 8,600. Then I began working backward from memory. The granite countertops, the 18,000. The kitchen renovation, 6,500. The down payment on their house of 47, the Lozen from my home equity loan. 60 monthly mortgage payments of 2,100 each, 8,000. The numbers lined up like soldiers, each one a reminder of a time I'd chosen their comfort over my own future. When the page was full, I closed the book. It was the first time in years I'd seen the truth in black and white. And I decided right then there would be no new entries in this ledger. Not ever again. They thought that Mercedes was just a car. They thought it was another chapter in the story where Dad always comes through, where Dad sacrifices, where Dad says yes. But for me, it was the ending of that story. I didn't tell them right away. Some truths aren't for sharing in the heat of the moment. They're for carrying until you're ready to set them down in the right place. Prize, I knew my right place was coming. And when it did, I'd be holding more than just the truth. I'd be holding every receipt, every canceled check, every page of that ledger. Prize. And they'd have to look at all of it. I hadn't seen Harold Whitman in almost a decade, but I knew if anyone could help me take my life back without turning it into a public circus, it was him. Prize. Harold and I met 50 years ago on a job site in Boise. Two young men in hard hats and calloused hands swinging hammers for 12 hours a day. He was all angles and certainty. Prize, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once and then double-checked just to be sure. I remember Linda once said, "If Harold ever trades his hammer for a pen, Prize, you better believe the words will be as straight as the nails he drives." She was right. 15 years later, Harold walked into a courthouse instead of a construction site. Prize, wearing a suit that somehow made him look even more solid. He'd become a lawyer who still thought like a builder. Every case was a structure, every argument a beam that had to be strong enough to hold. The morning I decided to call him Room 217 felt smaller than usual. Maybe it was the rain tapping the window, Prize, or the faint smell of bleach in the hallway. A reminder that someone down the hall had left the room for good. I dialed his number on the old pay phone in the lobby. It rang twice before I heard his voice. Prize. Whitman. It's Dennis. A pause.
Well, I'll be damned.
I thought you'd moved to Florida. Not exactly. He didn't press. Coffee, my treat. Prize, and Dennis, bring whatever's bothering you. And we met at a small cafe near the courthouse. The place smelled of fresh bread and burned espresso. Harold was already seated, a legal pad in front of him, pen in hand. "Show me." He said no small talk. I slid the manila folder across the table, the ledger, the bank statements, the Facebook photo printed in color, Michael's smile crisp on the page. Prize. Harold scanned each document with the same precision I'd seen him use when reading blueprints. His eyes didn't widen, his mouth didn't twist in surprise. But his pen began tapping the tabletop. Prize, a sure sign he was calculating. "This isn't just a bad decision on their part," he said finally. "It's elder financial abuse. And in this state, Prize, that's a felony." The word felony felt strange in the air, like hearing your own name in a language you don't speak. I sat back in my chair watching people bustle in and out of the cafe, Prize carrying to-go cups and muffins, living lives untouched by the realization I just had my son wasn't just careless. He was a criminal in the eyes of the law. Harold leaned forward. "Prize, we can file a cease and desist on any further use of your funds, freeze the joint accounts, and if you want, pursue restitution. But Dennis, once we start..." "Prize, you can't go back." I thought about Room 217, about Linda's quilt, about the fact that the last real choice I'd made for myself was what to pack in my suitcase the day they moved me in. "Prize, I'm ready," I said. We started with the simplest thing, stopping the money flow. One form, 2 signatures, and every automatic payment to Michael's mortgage vanished into air. Prize, Harold had me open a new account, one only I could touch. Then he drafted a letter, short, sharp, without a single wasted word, effective immediately. Prize, Dennis Graham will no longer provide financial support for Michael Graham or his household. Any further use of his funds without explicit permission will be met with legal action. Prize, it was like watching a master carpenter cut a beam in one smooth stroke. No hesitation. No splinters. When I left the cafe that day, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, weight in my own hands. Prize, the weight of choice. Back in room 217, I took out Linda's notebook and wrote, "Today I learned a pen can cut cleaner than any saw, and some cuts are the beginning of building something new." Anger is heavy. Surprise, it's loud, it fills a room. But resolve is quiet. It's a foundation. You don't see it, but it holds everything that comes after. That day with Harold wasn't about revenge. Not yet. Surprise, it was about remembering that my life, my money, my choices still belonged to me. Michael would learn that soon enough. But first I had building to do. The ghost of a porch swing. Prize. There's a sound I still hear sometimes, even in the silence of room 200, the slow, steady creak of the porch swing on our old house in Idaho. It's not just a sound, it's a rhythm. Prize. The way the chains groaned when you first sat down, then fell into a soft, almost invisible sway. The way the boards underfoot gave off that faint pine smell when the sun hit them just right. Prize. Linda claimed that swing the day we moved in, long before the kids came along. I remember her in a white cotton dress, standing barefoot on that half-finished porch. Prize. Squinting at the horizon like she was already imagining 100 sunsets there. "This is where we'll sit when we're old," she said, brushing a stray hair from her cheek. Prize. "This is where the best conversations will happen." And she was right. That porch became the backdrop to almost every chapter of our lives. Linda with a baby in her lap, surprise humming songs I never knew the names of. Todd and Michael, sticky with melted popsicles, sprawled on the steps after chasing each other in the yard. Friends stopping by, surprise. Leaning against the railing while we passed around lemonade and sweating glasses. It wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to impress anyone, but it was ours. After she passed, I couldn't sit there alone. I'd walk past it, my hand brushing the cool chain, but the idea of sitting without her, it felt like trying to read a book with the last chapter torn out. And then, after Michael and Stephanie decided that a retirement community was more convenient for everyone, the porch was gone entirely. No swing, no maple tree, no space that felt like mine. Except it wasn't really gone. It followed me. In the quiet hours, in the smell of morning coffee, in the ache of wanting to belong somewhere again. So when Harold leaned over the diner table one afternoon and asked, "What do you want to do with what you've got left, Dennis?" The first image in my mind wasn't a legal document or a bank account. It was that swing, finding the bones of something new. Harold didn't laugh when I told him. He didn't say it was sentimental or impractical. He just scribbled something in his notebook and said, "All right, let's find your porch." We spent the next week looking at spaces. Some were too polished, gleaming floors, white walls, the kind of places that smelled like scented candles and business plans. They didn't feel right. "I need something with history," I told Harold as we stepped out of yet another storefront that looked like it belonged to a yoga studio. Somewhere people can leave their fingerprints and not get yelled at. On the 8th day we found it. A narrow brick building on the corner of 5th and Elm. The front window was cloudy with dust, and the For Lisa's sign hung crooked like it had given up. The paint on the door was peeling, and the step creaked when I tested it. But when I pushed the door open, after a stubborn tug, the smell of sawdust hit me like a memory. It was empty, save for an old counter and a few forgotten shelves. The floors were scuffed, the walls uneven. Sunlight streamed through the high front windows, turning the dust in the air into tiny floating stars. I walked through slowly, running my hand along the window frame. Touching the grooves in the wood where 100 hands had done the same before me. "Perfect," I said. Harold raised an eyebrow at the water stain on the ceiling. "Perfect? Good bones," I told him. "This place has seen work. It knows what it means to last." Harold gave me that lawyer's half smile. "The one that says you're crazy, but I've seen you pull off crazy before." He didn't argue. He just pulled a yellow legal pad from his briefcase and started jotting down numbers, questions, and a few things I didn't understand but trusted him to handle. We did a slow lap of the place, him looking at the plumbing and electrical outlets. Me running my hand over the walls like I was greeting an old friend. In the back room, there was a stack of warped plywood leaning against the wall, probably forgotten by whoever had been here last. I knocked on one, solid. A little sanding, maybe some trimming, and it could be turned into shelves. Lease terms are probably flexible, Harold said, peering at the dusty front window. Nobody's been here in a while. I could feel it already. The hum of a place ready to come alive again. A hum you only hear if you've built things with your own hands. We signed the papers that Friday. Harold handled the legal side, and I just had to scrawl my name on the dotted line. The pen felt heavy in my hand, not like a burden, but like a hammer when you're about to drive the first nail. That first morning with the keys in my pocket, I walked from the nursing home to the corner of 5th and Elm. The early air was sharp, the kind that makes you pull your jacket tighter. The building waited for me, silent but somehow expectant. When I opened the door, the smell of dust and wood hit me again. Sunlight cut across the floor in long slanted stripes. I stood there for a full minute just listening to the quiet. Then I rolled up my sleeves. The first job was sweeping. Years of dust, tiny nails, scraps of paper with faded writing. All of it went into a garbage bag. I found an old wrench under the counter, a child's marble by the door, and a coffee can full of screws rusted together. Every little discovery felt like uncovering the building's memory. The next day I rented a sander and worked the floors until the boards began to glow like honey. My hands ached, but it was the kind of ache that meant something. By the 3rd week I had built my first workbench from reclaimed pine I found at a salvage yard. The wood had deep scars and nail holes from its previous life. But once sanded and sealed, it was beautiful. I left the marks in. I wanted people to see that worn didn't mean worthless. The neighbors began to notice. Jerry, a retired machinist from 2 streets over, stopped by one afternoon. He stood in the doorway taking it all in. "Looks like you're fixing up the old Perkins place," he said. Trying to, I told him. He stepped inside, ran a hand over the workbench. I've got a box of chisels sitting in my garage. Don't need 'em anymore. You want 'em? I smiled. They get more use here than collecting dust. 2 days later, he brought them in a cardboard box, each one wrapped in newspaper from the 1980s. Marla, a widow from the block over, came by with a stack of fabric swatches. In case you ever think about a sewing corner, she said, setting them on the bench. I hadn't thought about it, but maybe she was right. This didn't have to be just a woodshop. It could be anything people needed it to be. A place where hands could be busy and hearts could be steady. That was when I knew Linda's porch was already more than an idea. It was breathing. I didn't tell Michael. As far as he knew, my days began and ended in that nursing home room. Coffee in a paper cup, a view of the parking lot, maybe a crossword puzzle if I was feeling ambitious. But each morning after breakfast, I'd sign out at the front desk. Karen, the receptionist, would give me a knowing smile, the kind that says I'm not asking questions. Then I'd take that 4-block walk to the corner of 5th and Elm, keys in my pocket, the air waking me up with every step. Inside, it was always colder than outside in the morning. The floor creaked under my boots, and the first thing I'd do was flick on the old hanging light above the workbench. It hummed and buzzed for a few seconds before settling into a steady glow. I started with the walls. Patched up holes, sanded the rough spots, gave them a coat of warm cream paint I bought on clearance. The difference was instant. The space didn't feel abandoned anymore. The first project I built there wasn't for me. Jerry came by one afternoon, standing in the doorway like he wasn't sure if he should come in. You busy? He asked. Not busy enough to turn you away, I said. He stepped inside and after a long pause, told me about his granddaughter Ellie. She was starting college in the fall and needed a small desk for her dorm. I offered to help him make it. We spent 3 afternoons working on that desk. Jerry's hands were slower than they used to be, but he still measured twice, cut once. He told me stories about the machine shop he'd worked in for 40 years, about the time he almost lost a finger. About how his wife used to bring him lunch wrapped in wax paper. When we finished, the desk was simple but sturdy, just like Jerry. He ran his hand along the edge, a little mist in his eyes. She'll keep this for a long time, he said. That was the moment I realized Linda's porch wasn't just a workshop. It was a place for people to remember who they were before the world decided they were done. Every hammer swing, every wood shaving on the floor was proof we weren't finished. Not yet. Michael wouldn't see it coming. Not because I wanted to hide it from him forever, but because I didn't need his approval to build it. Linda's porch was for the ones like Jerry, like Marla, like me. People who'd been reduced to a room, a routine, a calendar of mealtimes. Here, we were more than that. Here, we built things that lasted. And one day Michael would walk by and see the lights on, hear the sound of a saw, smell the wood and coffee. And maybe, just maybe, he'd realize what I had built without him. It was a Tuesday morning when I found it, a plain white envelope sitting dead center on my workbench at Linda's porch. No stamp, no name on the front, just my name, Dad, written in Michael's handwriting. I stood there staring at it for a full minute. It had been months since I'd heard from him, beyond the occasional "Hope you're doing okay" text. Part of me wanted to toss it in the trash without opening it. But curiosity is a stubborn thing, especially when it comes to your own blood. I slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't long, just a few lines in Michael's tidy script. Dad, there's an event this Saturday night, a fundraiser at the country club. Stephanie and I thought you might want to come. Dress is formal. On a fundraiser at the country club. Michael never invited me to those. In his world, country clubs weren't for men with calloused hands and worn jackets, which meant this wasn't really about me. Saturday came cold and gray. I wore my best suit, the one Linda picked out for our 40th anniversary. It was a little snug in the shoulders now, but it still smelled faintly of cedar from the old wardrobe. Harold offered to drive me. Just in case, he said. I didn't ask what "in case" meant. When we pulled up, the place was glowing with warm light, valet drivers in black vests jogging to open doors. Inside, it smelled of wine and perfume, and the sound of polite laughter echoed under the high ceilings. I spotted Michael across the room in a tailored navy suit. He was talking to a group of men, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a champagne flute. Stephanie stood beside him in a red dress that probably cost more than my first truck. When he saw me, his smile flickered, not the wide grin of a son seeing his father, but the polite, tight-lipped smile you give when your boss's boss shows up unannounced. Dad, he said, surprised, patting my shoulder like I was a colleague. Glad you could make it. We made small talk. He asked about my health. I asked about the kids. It was all surface, no depth, no swing on the porch. Surprise. Then the speeches started. The fundraiser was for a senior outreach program, a partnership between the country club and a nonprofit. As the speaker droned on, I noticed Michael's stealing glances at me. Surprise. And then it hit me. He hadn't invited me out of kindness. I was here to be a prop. The story of my father living in a wonderful care facility made him look like the perfect, prized, dutiful son in front of his friends and donors. The speaker wrapped up with a round of applause, and the host invited guests to mingle. That's when Michael guided me. No, steered me toward a cluster of people by the fireplace. Dad, I'd like you to meet the Donovans, he said, his tone carrying that polished enthusiasm people use when they're closing a deal. They've been very supportive of the Senior Outreach Initiative. Mrs. Donovan, a woman in pearls and a silk scarf, reached for my hand. We've heard such wonderful things about you, she said. I almost laughed. Is that right? Yes, she went on, glancing at Michael. Your son tells us you're very well taken care of. Beautifully. I could feel Michael's eyes on me, silently urging me to nod, to smile, to play along. So I did smile, just not the way he expected. Well, I said, I'm certainly adjusting, but truth be told, I spend most of my days outside that wonderful facility. Oh, Mrs. Donovan's eyebrows arched. That's right, I run a place called Linda's Porch, a workshop and gathering space for older folks who've been, let's say, left behind by the people who should have stood by them. Michael's grip on my shoulder tightened just enough for me to notice. Mrs. Donovan looked intrigued. How marvelous. And your son helps you with this. I let the question hang for a second. No, this one I built on my own. There it was, the tiniest flinch from Michael. The group shifted uncomfortably. Surprise. Polite smiles stiffening. Michael's laugh came a little too quickly.
Dad's being modest,
he said. He's always been independent. I excused myself before he could spin the narrative further. I walked out onto the balcony where the cold air hit like a splash of water. Below, the golf course stretched into darkness, dotted with faint lights. I stayed there until I heard the sliding door open behind me. Michael stepped out, closing the door so we were alone. His jaw was tight. What was that in there? What was what? You blindsided me. Surprised, Dad. These people heard the truth. I cut in. Maybe for the first time tonight. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Look, the outreach program needs visibility. If you'd just let me bring a few photographers to your workshop, it could help everyone. And it would help me. There it was. The real reason for the invitation. I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. You want Linda's porch for a photo op? It's mutually beneficial, he said, smoothing his tone. I can get you funding, equipment, press coverage. I looked him straight in the eye. You can't buy what I built, Michael. Not with money, and not with a story that makes you look like the hero. His face hardened. Then I guess you don't want my help. I smiled faintly. I guess not. Michael's gaze lingered on me, a mixture of disbelief and irritation, like he couldn't quite fathom that I'd turn him down. He was used to me saying yes, to his requests, his needs, his emergencies that somehow always required my wallet or my time. But this wasn't about money. It was about ownership. Linda's porch had my fingerprints on every nail and board. The air inside carried the sound of real laughter, not the rehearsed kind you hear at gala events. It wasn't built for applause, it was built for belonging. You're making a mistake, he said finally, his voice low but sharp. I've made plenty, I replied, but not this one. We stood there in the cold until the muffled sound of music and clinking glasses seeped through the balcony doors. Inside, the party carried on, oblivious to the conversation that had just drawn a line neither of us could step back from. I left before dessert was served. Didn't say goodbye to the Donovans or Stephanie, or anyone else. Harold was waiting in the parking lot, reading a newspaper under the dome light. He didn't ask what happened, and I didn't tell him. Not yet. When we drove away, I glanced in the side mirror. Michael was still inside, framed in the golden glow of the club's entrance, shaking hands and smiling for cameras. The distance between us had never looked so clear. That night, back in my small nursing home room, I took out a notepad and started a list. At the top, I wrote things they can't take. Under it, I wrote the sound of Linda's porch swing. The smell of sawdust at dawn. The faces of Jerry Marla and the others when they finished something with their own hands. The knowledge that I built something without permission, approval, or strings attached. I put the list in my nightstand drawer, not to hide it, but to remind myself, whenever the world tries to claim what's mine, that some things aren't for sale. And as I drifted off to sleep, I realized this was more than a refusal. It was a promise. The door that should have stayed shut. It was a Thursday morning at Linda's porch, the kind where the air outside had that crisp bite of late autumn. Inside, Jerry was planing the edge of a cedar board, humming some old Sinatra tune, while Marla fussed over a half-finished quilt near the front window. I was at the workbench sanding down a set of shelves for the reading corner when I heard the door swing open. Fast, too fast for one of the regulars. Michael stood there. No smile. No hey, just a suit, a perfect knot, and an expression that said he was already impatient. Next place, he said, scanning the room like an appraiser. His gaze landed on the tool racks, the work tables. Surprised, the neatly stacked wood along the wall. Bigger than I pictured. I kept my hands on the sandpaper. What brings you here? I was in the area. That was a lie. Michael never just happened to be in this part of town. This was a 4-block detour from his version of the city. Years ago, when Michael was 16, he'd just stopped by my workshop at the old house. Said he wanted to hang out. 2 hours later, I found out he was really there to borrow the truck for a date. That day, I gave him the keys without a word. I told myself it was just part of being a father. Making sacrifices without keeping score. Now, decades later, I knew better. Visits like this always came with a hook hidden somewhere. Michael didn't waste time. Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation at the country club. I didn't look up from the shelf I was sanding. The one where you wanted to turn this place into a photo op. He exhaled through his nose, the way he used to when I told him to mow the lawn before going out with his friends.
You're being stubborn.
I'm being clear, I corrected. Fine, he said, his tone sharpening. Then maybe you'll want to hear this. There's a developer interested in this block. They're talking about buying out the leases, putting in a new retail complex. If you play your cards right, if you work with me, we could secure you a payout that would set you up for the rest of your life. I set the sandpaper down slowly. Set me up for the rest of my life. Michael, I've already lived most of it. And this, I gestured to the room, to Jerry bent over his cedar board, to Marla humming at her sewing machine. This is the rest of my life. Michael's jaw tightened. You're thinking too small. Dad! This hobby shop! It's not a hobby shop. I cut in, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. It's a place where people remember they still matter. He glanced at Jerry, then at Marla, as if trying to see what I saw. But his eyes didn't land on them long enough for it to sink in. You can't stop change. This neighborhood is going to look different in a year. You could walk away with enough to move somewhere better. Better for who? I asked. For you, he said, but the way he avoided my gaze told me it was better for him, for his reputation, for whatever deal he was trying to close with this mysterious developer. Jerry straightened up from his workbench, brushing sawdust off his apron. Everything okay here, Dennis? Fine, I said, though my voice had cooled. Michael forced a polite smile for Jerry. I'm just trying to help my father make the most of an opportunity. Jerry didn't miss a beat. Looks to me like he's already doing that. Then he went back to planing the cedar board. The sound of the blade scraping wood filled the silence between us. Michael stepped closer, lowering his voice. Dad, I can't protect this place forever. If the developer moves forward, they can buy out your lease whether you want it or not. If you let me represent you, I can make sure you walk away with something instead of nothing. I leaned against the bench, crossing my arms. I don't need protection from you, Michael. And I'm not walking away. His eyes narrowed. Then you're making things harder than they need to be. I reached into my back pocket, pulled out a folded sheet of paper and slid it across the workbench. This is the renewal I signed with the landlord last week. 5 years, non-transferable. No early termination without my consent. The look on his face was worth every splinter I'd pulled from my hands since opening this place. You went behind my back, he said, almost incredulous. No, I said quietly. I just built something without asking your permission. For a second, I thought he might say something that would burn the last bridge between us. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked out, the bell above the door jingling like a punctuation mark. The smell of sawdust filled the air again as Jerry resumed his work. Marla didn't ask questions, just handed me a spool of thread for the quilt frame. Linda's porch was still ours. I watched through the front window as Michael crossed the street. his polished shoes avoiding every puddle like they were beneath him. He didn't look back, and I didn't expect him to. There was a time when I would have followed, called out Prize, asked him to sit down with me, tried to explain why this place mattered. But I've learned something in these late chapters of life. Some truths aren't meant to be sold, softened, prized, or packaged so they'll be easier to swallow. Some truths just have to stand on their own, like the frame of a house that's weathered every storm. Inside, Jerry set down his plane and stretched his back. Prize, he said, my grandson once tried to sell my old fishing boat without asking me. Said it was just taking up space. I told him, that boat took me to places you've never even dreamed of. Prize. That's worth more than money. I smiled at that. Not because I cared about fishing, but because I knew exactly what he meant. Marla looked up from her quilt and asked, Surprise. Was that your boy? Yeah, I said. She studied me for a moment, then went back to stitching. He doesn't get it yet, but maybe someday he will. That night, when I locked up Linda's porch, Prize, I stood for a moment in the doorway. The smell of cedar, the quiet hum of the old heater, the faint chalk marks on the workbench where Jerry had measured out his cuts. All of it was still here. Prize, Michael could chase his developments, his country club friends, his photo ops. But here in this space we'd keep building. Prize. And maybe that was the quietest revenge of all. Not tearing down what someone else built, but keeping your own creation standing, no matter who tried to buy it out from under you. Surprise, the cold that bit through wood. The first snow came early that year. Heavy, wet flakes that stuck to the windows of Linda's porch before the calendar even turned to December. At first, it was beautiful. Prize. The white drifts softened the cracked sidewalks, made the neighborhood look like a postcard. But postcards don't tell you about the cold that seeps in when the heater dies. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Prize, I just unlocked the door when a blast of frigid air rushed past me. The kind of cold that bites straight through your coat and settles in your bones. The old gas furnace in the corner was silent. No hum. Prize, no heat. Just the faint smell of something burned out. Jerry came in a few minutes later, stamping the snow off his boots. Feels like the inside of my freezer in here, he said, rubbing his hands together. Prize. I checked the thermostat, hoping it was just a glitch. It wasn't. The needle was buried at the bottom. We had projects to finish. Marla's quilt, the birdhouses for the neighborhood fundraiser, Prize, the bookshelf I'd been building for the reading corner. But all I could think about was how quickly a place can go from warm and welcoming to uninhabitable. By noon, you could see your breath in the air. Surprised, the old wood on the worktables felt like ice. Marla had wrapped herself in her quilt in progress just to keep her fingers moving. Jerry wore his coat and scarf inside, his cheeks red from the cold. Prize. This isn't going to work, Dennis, Jerry said, setting down his plane. If we can't fix this today, we'll have to close until it's sorted out. Closing Linda's porch wasn't an option. Prize. Not in December. Not when this was the one place someone still felt alive. I called the repair company. The woman on the other end told me, Prize, the earliest we can send someone is Friday. That's 3 days from now, I said. Busy season, she replied. Everyone's heat is going out. I hung up and looked around the room. Prize, Jerry's hands were shaking from the cold. Marla's stitches were uneven. The others who drifted in that day barely stayed an hour before heading home. For the first time since opening Linda's porch, Prize, I felt the weight of a truth I'd been trying to ignore. This place was fragile. One broken part, one missed bill, one harsh winter could take it from us. By mid-afternoon, Prize, the light through the frosted windows had gone gray. The sound of work, hammers tapping planes shaving wood, had slowed to almost nothing. Even the radio in the corner was silent. Surprised, I turned it off because the cold made every note sound brittle. Harold stopped by, stomping snow from his boots. He took one look around and said, Feels like a meat locker in here. Prize, what happened? Furnace died, I told him. He whistled through his teeth. That thing's older than you, Dennis. I've got someone coming Friday. Friday, he shook his head. Prize. You'll freeze before then? The truth was, he wasn't wrong. I could feel the cold creeping into my fingers, numbing them even through my gloves. Marla had stopped sewing entirely. Surprise, just sat there rubbing her hands together. This place has seen worse winters. I tried to say lightly, but no one looked convinced. Not even me. Prize. That's when I realized this was more than a heating problem. It was a test, the kind winters give you when you're too sure of your footing. We had two choices: send everyone home until Friday, Prize, or find a way to keep the doors open and the work going. And I wasn't about to see Linda's porch go dark, even for a few days. I told everyone to take a break and meet me back here in an hour. Prize. They didn't ask why, maybe because they'd seen that look in my eyes before. Harold drove me to the storage unit I'd been renting since Linda passed. Most of it was filled with things I couldn't bear to part with yet. Her rocking chair, the box of family photos, the tin of Christmas ornaments we'd bought over 40 years. And in the very back, under an old tarp, was the thing I was looking for, a cast iron wood stove. It was heavy, blackened from years of use, the kind of thing you only buy once in a lifetime. I'd picked it up in the 80s when we were renovating the house, then retired it to the garage when we switched to central heating. Now it was going to save us. Harold helped me wrestle the stove into the back of his pickup. Snow swirled around us, clinging to our coats and eyelashes. By the time we got it to Linda's porch, my breath felt like shards of glass in my chest. Jerry's eyes widened when he saw it. Haven't laid eyes on one of those in years. Then you know it works, I said, surprise. We cleared a space near the far wall, right under the old chimney vent I'd noticed months ago, but never thought I'd use. Harold fetched the stovepipe sections from the storage unit while Jerry rooted around in the back room for the stack of firewood we kept for the outdoor fire pit. Within an hour, the stove was in place. Harold struck a match, and soon the first crackle of flames filled the room. The heat came slow, radiating outward like the sunrise. Marla still wrapped in her quilt. Shuffled closer and held her hands over the top. "Smells like my grandparents' house," she said softly. It wasn't the even, steady heat of the old furnace, but it was alive. It breathed and hissed and warmed the air with a kind of stubbornness that matched our own. By evening, the cold no longer owned the room. Jerry had taken off his scarf. Marla's stitches were straight again. And the rest of the regulars stayed until closing, their cheeks flushed from the firelight. When I locked up that night, I put my hand on the stove's warm surface. It was more than a fix. It was a reminder. We still had other ways to keep the cold out, ways no contractor or schedule could control. Friday came and the repairman finally showed up. He fixed the furnace in under an hour, then packed up and left without a word about the old stove in the corner. I thought about moving it back to storage, but I didn't. Somehow, it belonged here now, a piece of the past anchoring us against whatever winters were still ahead. You can plan all you want. You can schedule repairs and budget for emergencies. But sometimes, survival isn't about what you plan, it's about what you remember. That stove wasn't just iron and bolts. It was the smell of our first house. It was the winters when Linda and I would sit beside it with coffee, watching snow pile high against the windows. It was proof that even when the heat goes out, you can still keep the fire. It was a Wednesday morning, quiet enough that I could hear the ticking of the wall clock over the faint hum of the furnace. The snow outside had melted into grimy slush. Leaving the streets looking tired and gray. When I opened the front door of Linda's porch, there it was, a plain white envelope lying face up on the doormat. No return address. Just my name in block letters, typed, not written. I almost left it there, figuring it was junk mail. But something about the weight of it felt wrong, heavier than a bill, lighter than a catalog. Inside, I found a single sheet of paper with the letterhead of First Union Bank. The words were cold, stripped of any human warmth. This is a courtesy notice to inform you that the property at 413 East Oak Street is currently under review for possible foreclosure proceedings due to delinquent payments by the property owner. The property owner wasn't me. I leased Linda's porch from a landlord named Russell Tate, a man who lived 3 states away and collected rent like clockwork. If he was missing payments to the bank, it meant the building was in trouble. And by extension, so were we. I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope, feeling that old weight in my chest. The same one I'd felt the day Michael told me I was better off in a nursing home, the feeling of being small against a decision someone else had already made. But this time, I wasn't going to just sit there and let it happen. I called Russell that afternoon. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious, like he knew why I was calling. "Russell, it's Dennis," I said. "I got a letter from the bank today." A pause, then a sigh. "Yeah, I was hoping to handle it before you found out. Handle it how?" "I've had some setbacks." "Lost a couple of other tenants during COVID. The rent you pay covers the basics, but the mortgage is, well, it's bigger than the basics." "Russell," I said slowly, "are we talking months behind?" Or weeks? 3 months, he admitted. "They've given me until the end of next month to catch up, or they'll start the process." I stared at the shelves in front of me, at the birdhouses Jerry had finished and the quilt Marla had folded neatly on the table. "And if they take the building, you'll get notice." Probably 60 days to vacate. I'm sorry, Dennis. Prize. I know this place means something to you. Means something didn't cover it. This wasn't just a hobby or a workshop. It was the one place where the people here weren't treated like burdens. Surprise, and I wasn't going to watch it disappear because of someone else's missed payments. 60 days isn't enough, I said. Not for me, Prize, and not for the people who come here. I'll do what I can, Russell replied, but his tone told me he didn't have a plan. Prize. If I can sell one of my other properties, you think you'll find a buyer in 30 days in this market? I didn't mean to sound sharp, but the words came out that way. Prize. He was silent for a long moment. I'm sorry, Dennis. I never meant for you to get caught in the middle. Caught in the middle. Prize. That was the story of my life lately. Between my son's ambitions and my own principles. Between the nursing home's rules and the freedom I wanted. Prize. Between the warmth of this place and the cold world outside. But I'd learned something over these last months. When you're caught in the middle, you still get to choose which way to lean. Surprise. And I was leaning toward saving Linda's porch, even if it meant stepping into a fight I hadn't started. That night, after locking up, I stayed at the workbench long after the others had gone home. Prize. The stove in the corner glowed faintly, throwing shadows across the walls. I took out my old ledger, the one I'd used when Linda and I ran the contracting business. My handwriting was smaller now. Surprise. More cramped, but my mind was clear. I started listing names, the regulars, the part-timers, the people who'd passed through here and left something behind. A carving, a shelf, a story. Next to each name. Surprise, I wrote what they'd built, what they'd gained since coming here. Then I made a second list, people in town who owed me favors. Former clients, old friends. Prize. Even the mayor's brother whose deck I'd rebuilt after a storm, refusing to take payment because Linda had baked him pies for years. By the time I put the pen down, I knew what I was going to do. Surprise, it wasn't legal in the strictest sense. It wasn't even entirely honest. But it was ours, and it might be enough to buy us time. I closed the ledger, slid it into my bag, surprise, and whispered into the empty room, "We're not going anywhere." The next morning, I started quietly. No announcements, no big speeches. Just conversations over coffee. Prize, in the sawdust-scented air of Linda's porch. With Jerry, it was simple. "You remember that cedar chest you made for your daughter's wedding?" "Course I do," he said. Prize. "How would you feel about building a few more and selling them?" With Marla, I asked if she could finish her quilt ahead of schedule. Prize. "I know a collector in town who'd pay good money for work like yours," I told her. And with Harold, I didn't even need to ask. He'd already overheard enough to guess something was wrong. "Prize, just tell me what to make," he said. Within hours, the hum of the workshop had changed. The sound was sharper, faster. People weren't just passing the time anymore. They were working with intent. Prize. I reached out to the people on my second list. One by one, I had too many details. That Linda's porch needed help. Not a handout, but a trade. We'd build them something lasting. Surprise, and in return, they'd pay up front. It was risky. Pre-orders meant pressure, and we were already racing the clock. But if we could bring in enough cash, Prize, maybe I could offer Russell something. Enough to cover the arrears, or at least keep the bank from moving in too soon. By the end of the week, the order board was full: cedar chests, rocking chairs, Prize birdhouses, bookshelves. Marla had a quilt commission that would cover a month's rent on its own. Russell called me on Friday, sounding both surprised and wary. "You've been sending me checks," he said. "Prize?" "Not enough yet," I told him. "But more's coming. Tell the bank you're making payments. Buy us time. Dennis, you didn't have to." "Yes," I said, cutting him off. Surprise, I did. Saving Linda's porch wasn't about charity. Prize. It was about proving that we could stand on our own, that a room full of so-called leftovers from life still had value in a world that liked to forget them. Prize. The bank might still come for the building one day. Russell might still lose it. But if that day came, they weren't going to find us sitting still. They'd find us working. They'd find us building. Prize. And maybe, just maybe, they'd see we'd built something no letter from a bank could foreclose. It had been 3 weeks since the letter from the bank, and Linda's porch was humming again. Prize. The stove still burned in the corner. The order board was cluttered with chalk marks, and the sound of saws and hammers blended with the faint strains of an old jazz station on the radio. Prize. That's when I saw it. A silver Mercedes, the kind that looked like it belonged in a commercial, with winding coastal roads and champagne sunsets. It pulled up to the curb outside, idling. Prize. Michael stepped out. Tailored coat, polished shoes, haircut just so. He looked like someone who had come from a meeting that decided other people's futures. When he walked in, the room seemed to quiet, not from awe, but from the way strangers quiet when someone important looking steps into a space they don't quite belong in. "Dad," he said, smiling the way you smile when you're about to sell something. "Got a minute?" I wiped my hands on a rag and nodded toward the back room. "Let's talk there." He didn't waste time. "I heard about the bank situation, and I've been thinking maybe this is the right moment for us to work together." I leaned against the counter. "Go on." He placed a glossy folder on the table and slid it toward me. Inside were renderings, shiny glass storefronts, landscaped walkways, a cafe with outdoor seating. "This could be Linda's porch," he said, tapping a picture of a sleek, open-plan space with big windows. "We move you into one of the new units in the development I'm working on. Prime location. All modern amenities. I cover the transition costs. You keep your program running without the threat of foreclosure." It was smooth, polished. A deal that on paper looked like a lifeline. But paper can't show you what's missing. There was no stove in the corner, no smell of sawdust, no creak of the old floorboards where Jerry liked to stand. Just clean lines and a silence that felt sterile. I closed the folder and looked at him. "And what happens to this building if I take your offer?" "They'll tear it down," Michael said. "Matter of fact. It's outdated. Costs too much to bring up to code. The land's worth more than the structure." I glanced toward the workshop door. Where I could just make out Marla's voice humming softly as she sewed, Jerry's steady rhythm of the hand playing on wood. "This place isn't just walls and a roof," I said. "It's also not forever," Michael countered. "Dad, think about it. You could have a safer space, better tools, climate control, more foot traffic." "You've already said you want to keep Linda's porch alive. I'm giving you the chance to do that without risking everything." "Without risking everything," I repeated slowly. "Here at the cost of everything." He frowned, confused. "You think moving it to your development will save it, but it won't be Linda's porch anymore. It'll be some designer's version of it. Sanitized, marketable." Michael sat back and crossed his arms. "Sometimes you have to compromise to keep something alive." I leaned forward. "I'll make you a deal, Michael. You use your influence to buy the building from Russell before the bank does. You put it in my name, no strings attached. I'll pay you back over time, interest included." He blinked. "That's not exactly the kind of deal I had in mind." "No," I said. "But it's the one that keeps Linda's porch as it is, alive in the way that matters." Michael tapped his fingers on the table, thinking. "You're asking me to sink my own money into a building the bank thinks is worthless." "No," I said quietly. "I'm asking you to invest in something your mother would have fought for." For a moment his eyes softened. Just for a moment. Then he stood, folder in hand. "I'll think about it." I watched him leave, the Mercedes pulling away from the curb like it had somewhere more important to be. The hum of the workshop came back slowly after the door closed behind him. Jerry stuck his head in from the main room. "That your boy?" "Yeah," I said. "He doesn't look much like a woodworker." I chuckled. "No." "But he's good at building other things. Like trouble." Jerry grinned and went back to his bench. That night I didn't go straight home. I stayed in the shop, the stove glowing faintly in the corner. The folder Michael had left was still on the table. I flipped it open again, looking at the gleaming, perfect lines of the new Linda's porch. He'd imagined. I could almost smell the fresh paint and the manufactured wood veneer. I could also see the emptiness in it. The kind of space where you'd be afraid to spill coffee on the counter. Afraid to hang your coat on a nail in the wall. The kind of place where laughter would sound too loud. I closed the folder for the last time. If Michael said no to my counteroffer, I'd find another way. I'd learned in life that rescue doesn't always come from the people you expect. And sometimes you have to be your own rescue. A week later, I got a short text from Michael, still thinking. I didn't wait for an answer before moving forward. The stove still burned, the orders kept coming in, and the people who filled this place with life didn't seem to care that the bank's clock was ticking. That was the thing about real community. It doesn't need perfect walls or designer floors. It just needs a place to gather and the will to keep showing up. And I knew deep down, that was something no one could buy and no one could replace. It was a Monday morning when I saw it. A single sheet of bright orange paper taped to the front door of Linda's porch. The wind had curled one corner, but the words were still there, stamped in heavy black ink. Notice of public auction property sale scheduled. The date was circled in red. 6 weeks from today. Prize. At first, I just stood there with my hand on the doorknob, staring. I could hear Harold's laugh inside, the steady buzz of the old space heater someone had plugged in next to Marla's table. Prize. The faint clink of Jerry's chisel on wood. Life was going on in there unaware. I pulled the paper off the door and folded it, slipping it into my coat pocket. Prize. The weight of it felt heavier than it should, like a rock I couldn't put down. This wasn't a letter from the bank, a warning, or a phone call I could ignore for a day. This was the countdown. Prize. The clock had started, and when it hit 0, the building that had been our shelter, our hearth, our proof that we still mattered, it would belong to whoever had the highest bid. Prize. I didn't tell anyone right away. Some truths need a plan before they're spoken. That night, after closing, I sent a message to 12 people. The ones I trusted most from our circle. Prize. I told them to meet at the shop after dinner, no explanations, just bring a coat and an open mind. By 7, they were all there. Jerry, Marla, Harold. Prize, even quiet old Ed, who usually slipped out before sunset. The stove glowed in the corner, throwing flickering shadows on the walls. I laid the orange notice on the table in the center of the room. No speeches. Prize, no sugarcoating. Just the truth. They're selling the building, I said. 6 weeks from now. Unless we do something, surprise, someone else will own this place, and they may not keep it standing. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Marla said softly, if it's gone. That's why we're here, I said. We have 6 weeks to make sure it isn't gone. Jerry leaned forward. You mean buy it?
Yes.
Harold laughed, surprised. Not unkindly. Dennis, you seen our wallets lately? I have, I said. That's why this isn't going to be about one person. It's about all of us. I looked around the table, surprised, at the worn faces and calloused hands. These people had built birdhouses and chairs, quilts and shelves. Not because it made them rich, but because it made them feel alive again. Prize. If we wait for someone else to save us, I said, we're done. But if we act like this place is already ours, maybe we can make it so. Ed shifted in his chair. Prize. How much are we talking? I'd done the math before they arrived. Russell owes about $40,000 on the mortgage. The auction starting bid will probably be half that, but bidding can go higher. Prize. If we can get $50,000 ready, we'll stand a chance. 50,000. The number landed like a hammer on the table. For some of them, it might as well have been 50 million. Prize. Marla was the first to speak after the silence. What do we do? I opened my ledger, the same one I'd used during the bank scare. Only now, the list wasn't for pre-orders or favors. This time, prize, it was for pledges. Anything you can give, money, skills, connections. Every dollar, every item we can sell, every person you know who might believe in what we're doing. Harold nodded slowly. Prize, we're not just making chairs anymore. No, I said. We're buying our home. And with that, the circle leaned in, not with fear, prize, but with the kind of resolve I'd seen before in men on job sites when a storm was coming and the roof wasn't done yet. You don't run, you get to work. By the next morning, surprise, the back wall of Linda's porch had been transformed. Sheets of butcher paper hung side by side with names, amounts, and projects scribbled in marker. Jerry pledged to make 3 cedar chests. Prize, Marla promised 2 quilts. Harold knew a man who bought reclaimed wood furniture for top dollar. Even Ed, who lived alone in a trailer, Prize pulled out a mason jar from his coat pocket and emptied a handful of crumpled bills onto the table. This is my winter heat fund, he said. If this place goes, Prize, I'll be cold anyway. The sight of it, the messy handwriting, the mismatched numbers, the stubborn determination in every line, felt like the first brick laid in a wall we were building together. Surprise, I didn't know if it would be enough. I didn't know if 6 weeks was long enough. But for the first time since I saw that orange paper, I didn't feel like I was standing alone in the cold. We had a wall, Prize, and we had each other. Word traveled faster than I expected. By the end of that week, people who hadn't set foot in Linda's porch for months started drifting back in. Some curious, Prize. Some carrying envelopes, some with nothing but a story about what this place had meant to them. A retired teacher brought in a stack of old maple boards from her late husband's workshop. Prize. He always said wood should be used, not stored, she told us. A young man I barely knew, a mechanic's apprentice, handed me a $50 bill and said, my granddad used to come here. Prize. Said it made him feel like he was part of something again. Even the mayor stopped by, leaning against the doorframe in his pressed shirt and polished shoes. Can't promise anything official, he said. Prize. But I'll spread the word. The pledge wall grew every day. We didn't just measure it in dollars, but in hours worked, items built, favors called in. Prize. Jerry worked late into the night on his cedar chests. Marla set up a sewing station by the stove so she could keep warm while her hands moved over the fabric. It wasn't perfect. Surprise, some days the donations slowed. Some nights I went home and wondered if we were just delaying the inevitable. But every morning I came back to find another name, another number, prize, another line on that wall, and the thought of losing it all felt less like surrender and more like a fight worth showing up for. In 6 weeks, we'd either win the auction or we wouldn't. Surprise, I couldn't control the bids, the bank, or the people with deeper pockets. What I could control was what we built between now and then. Not just the furniture, not just the money, prize, but the proof that we were more than tenants in someone else's building. We were owners in spirit already, and no gavel or piece of paper could take that from us. Prize. The county courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee. Its main hall was colder than the February air outside, not because of the temperature, prize, but because of the way everyone's eyes measured everyone else. The auction was set for 10 a.m., but by 9 the benches were already filling. People in work coats sat beside men in tailored suits. Prize, clipboards, coffee cups, folded arms. I took a seat in the third row, 2 benches back from the front. I could see the podium where the auctioneer would stand. Prize. The little table where the bank's representative sat with her file folder neatly closed. In my coat pocket, I carried an envelope, our total. Every pledge, every sale. Surprise, every crumpled bill we'd collected over the last 6 weeks. I'd counted it 3 times this morning, then stopped counting. The number was burned into my head anyway to 51,420. Enough to start. Prize. Not enough to finish if someone with deeper pockets wanted the building. I kept my eyes on the podium and tried not to think about that orange notice, still folded in the drawer at Linda's porch. Prize 6 weeks ago, it had been a death sentence. Today it felt more like a test, and I intended to pass. The auctioneer stepped up, glasses perched low on his nose, voice brisk and businesslike. Next property, 413 East Oak Street. Commercial lot. Current improvements include 1-story frame building, formerly occupied as woodworking and craft shop. Starting bid. Prize $20s and dollars. I raised my hand before anyone else. A man in a navy suit to my right lifted his card. 25. 30, I said. Prize. The numbers started climbing in neat $5,000 steps. 35. 45. My heart thudded with each nod of the auctioneer's head. Prize. Each quick flick of his gavel as he acknowledged the next bid. At 50,000 the room thinned. Only 3 of us still raising hands. Me, the man in the navy suit, and a woman I didn't recognize. Prize, her hair tied in a tight bun, pen tapping against her notepad. 55, the woman said. I didn't move right away. My hands felt heavy. 55 was already beyond what we'd scraped together. Prize. The auctioneer's eyes landed on me. Do I have 60? I could hear my own breath, loud in my ears. 60,000 meant stepping off the edge without knowing if there was anything to land on. Prize. But then I thought of Jerry's cedar chests lined up by the stove, of Marla's quilt spread across the table like a flag, of Ed's crumpled bills poured from that mason jar. Prize. I thought of the way they'd all leaned in around that pledge wall, faces lit with the stubborn light of people who refused to disappear. I raised my hand. 60. The room shifted. Surprise. The man in the navy suit hesitated, then shook his head. The woman with the bun scribbled something in her notepad, eyes narrowing. 65, she said. It felt like a punch to the ribs. Surprise. My envelope was already stretched. I could bid again, but it wouldn't be real money. Not yet. Prize. It would be hope and promises and the gamble that I could fill the gap before the bank's deadline for payment. I glanced toward the back of the room and saw him, Michael, standing in the doorway, Prize, hands in his pockets, watching the auctioneer called for 70. My lips parted, but before I could speak, Michael's voice rang out. 70. Every head turned. He walked forward. Surprise, calm as if he were buying lunch, and stood beside me. The woman with the bun faltered. Her pen stopped tapping. After a pause that felt like a lifetime, she shook her head. 70,000. Surprise, once or twice, the gavel came down. Sold. I turned to Michael, my voice low. You just bought it. No, he said, slipping his hands back into his pockets. We just bought it. Surprise. You'll pay me back. Same deal you offered before. I decided it was worth the risk. For a second, I couldn't speak. Then I just nodded, because anything more would have been too much for that moment. Prize. When we stepped out into the cold, the courthouse steps felt steeper than I remembered. Michael walked beside me without saying much, his breath fogging in the winter air. Prize. You'll get the paperwork in a few days, he said finally. Once the bank clears the sale, the building's yours. Well, yours and mine until you pay me back. I managed a half smile. Prize, and if I don't, he glanced at me, you will. Because you're too damn stubborn not to. The silver Mercedes was parked at the curb just like before. But this time, Prize, it didn't look like a symbol of distance between us. It was just a car, his car, waiting to take him back to whatever life he'd built. Before he got in, he said, "Prize, Dade, I know I've been more of a problem than a help. This doesn't erase anything, but maybe it's a start." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked past him, Prize, toward the street that would take me back to Linda's porch. Back to the stove, the pledge wall, the hum of saws and sewing needles. "It's a start," I said, and I meant it. Prize. When I walked into Linda's porch that afternoon, the air was warm, and the smell of cedar and coffee wrapped around me like an old coat. I told them we'd won, that the building was safe. Surprised, Jerry banged his hand on the workbench like it was a drum. Marla covered her mouth, eyes wet. Ed just nodded like he'd always known, or surprised, but I knew, and maybe they did too, that what we'd really saved wasn't just a building. It was proof that we could stand our ground, that we could fight for a home worth keeping. Surprise, even if it meant reaching into places we didn't think we'd go. And sometimes when you fight like that, you don't just keep the walls, you keep the soul inside them. The week after the auction, Prize, the snow came heavier than it had all season. Thick, wet flakes that muffled the streets, turned the roofs white, and made the world look softer than it really was. Inside Linda's porch, surprise, the stove burned, steady. The pledge wall was still up, though now it felt less like a battle plan and more like a war diary. Surprise, names and numbers frozen in time. A reminder of how close we'd come to losing everything. For the first few days, the shop had the same hum it always did. Jerry planed boards at his bench. Surprise, Marla's sewing machine rattled gently in the corner. Harold tinkered with a half-finished cabinet, humming something that might have been a hymn. But under it all, there was a new quiet. Prize, not the dangerous quiet of waiting for bad news, but the kind that comes when you've survived a storm and are still figuring out what the morning after means. It hit me one evening as I was locking up. Surprise. For 6 weeks, we'd lived on adrenaline, every day a fight, every conversation about the next dollar, the next pledge, the next way to keep the lights on. Now the fight was over. We'd won. Prize. But no one had told us what to do with ourselves once we weren't fighting anymore. By mid-January, the change became harder to ignore. Jerry started coming in later, sometimes skipping days altogether. Prize. When I asked, he said his knees had been acting up in the cold. Marla still sued, but the quilts sat finished in a neat stack for weeks before anyone bought one. Prize. Harold took to leaving right after lunch instead of staying until supper. Even I felt it, that strange emptiness after a long push. I'd walk into the shop, smell the cedar, hear the old stove ticking, Prize, and wonder if maybe part of me missed the urgency. One Friday afternoon, I found Ed sitting alone at the workbench, staring at a block of wood he hadn't touched in an hour. "You all right?" I asked. Surprise. He shrugged. "Gus, I just don't know what to make next." That was it, I thought. That was the problem. We'd been so busy saving Linda's porch that we'd forgotten the other half of the job. Prize. Living in it. That night I stayed late, the only light coming from the stove and the desk lamp by my ledger. I flipped back through the pledge wall notes, reading names, promises, Prize. The scribbles of ideas we'd never had time to try. A thought began to form, something bigger than just furniture or quilts. Something that might bring the fire back. The next Monday I called a meeting. Prize, not the kind with solemn faces and numbers on paper. This one had hot coffee, fresh bread from the bakery down the street, and chairs pulled into a loose circle around the stove. Prize. "I've been thinking," I began. "We spent 6 weeks proving we could fight for this place. Now I want us to prove we can grow it." Jerry raised an eyebrow. Surprise. Grow it how? By making Linda's porch more than just a workshop. By turning it into a place the whole town has a reason to visit. Prize, even if they don't need a chair or a quilt. Marla tilted her head. "You mean like events?" "Events, classes, exhibits, a winter fair." Prize. Anything that gets people in the door and reminds them why this place matters. I could see the skepticism in some faces. Change can be harder to swallow than a loss. But then Harold leaned forward, Prize, a slow grin spreading. "You mean we'd get to show off a little?" "Exactly," I said. By the end of that meeting, Prize, the pledge wall had a new section, this time filled with ideas instead of dollar amounts. Jerry offered to teach woodworking to kids on Saturdays. Prize. Marla suggested a quilt history display using pieces from her family. Ed, in a rare burst of enthusiasm, said he'd man a coffee corner for visitors. It wasn't adrenaline like before, Prize, but it was something better. Momentum. By February's end, the first winter fair at Linda's porch was underway. The air inside was thick with the smell of fresh sawdust, cinnamon from Ed's coffee stand, Prize, and the faint sweetness of Marla's quilt display. Children's laughter spilled from Jerry's woodworking corner, where little hands clumsily sanded blocks of pine. Surprise. People who hadn't been through our doors in years wandered in, drawn by curiosity or the sound of music from the old radio we'd propped by the stove. Some bought things, some didn't. Surprise. But they all stayed long enough to talk, to share a story, to feel the warmth that wasn't just from the fire. Standing by the door that day, I realized something I hadn't seen in the heat of the fight. Surprise. Saving Linda's porch had been about keeping a roof over our heads. Growing it was about making sure that roof covered more than just us. That winter, the snow outside kept falling, but inside, surprise, the cold never touched us. Not because of the stove, but because of the work we'd done to fill the room with life. And for the first time since the auction, surprise, I felt certain, not just hopeful, that we'd be here next winter too. It started with the sound of dripping. After months of silence under snow, surprise, the gutters along East Oak Street began to sing again, soft, steady trickles that carried the scent of wet earth into the air. From the porch steps, surprise, I could see patches of brown grass pushing through the slush, stubborn and thin, but alive. Across the street, Mrs. Callahan's maple tree dripped clear beads of water from its bare branches. Surprise. Each drop catching the pale sunlight before it fell. Inside, Linda's porch felt different. The stove was still burning, but the air didn't cling to your coat anymore. Surprise. People came in with hats tucked under their arms instead of pulled low over their ears. It wasn't just the weather changing. I could see it in the way Jerry whistled while he worked. Surprise. In how Marla left the front door propped open some afternoons, letting the cold air mix with the smell of cedar and coffee. Even Ed seemed lighter, sitting by the window instead of in the far corner. Surprise. Spring was coming, not just outside, but in us. And yet, with spring comes a different kind of test. Not the fight to keep warm or keep the doors open, but the harder one. Surprise. How do you hold on to what you've built when the season of urgency is over? One Thursday morning, a man in a tan suit walked into Linda's porch. Surprise. He didn't take off his coat or even look at the display tables. Instead, he went straight to where I was sanding a pine tabletop. "You Dennis Harper?" he asked. Surprise. That's me. He introduced himself as Alan Brooks, a developer from the city. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced. "I've been following what you folks have done here," he said. Surprise, glancing around the room. Impressive work, really impressive. I waited for the part that mattered. Surprise. I'm representing a group that's interested in acquiring this property. Keeping some of its current character, of course, but modernizing it. Surprise. "We'd like to make you an offer." I set the sander down. "We just bought it back 2 months ago." He nodded unfazed. "And you could sell it now for more than double what you paid." Surprise, enough to walk away comfortable. Maybe even start something new somewhere else. It was a clean offer, no tricks in his tone. But as he spoke, I saw the fair in my mind. The kids at Jerry's workbench. Surprise, the quilt Marla hung like a banner, Ed grinning behind his coffee stand. And I realized this wasn't just a business conversation. It was a temptation. I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I asked, "Surprise, you ever build something with your own hands, Mr. Brooks?" He hesitated. "Not exactly my skill set." "That's the thing about building," I said. "When you've put your hands on every nail, surprise, every board, every scrape of paint, you don't just own it. It owns you back." He gave a polite smile, the kind people give when they think you're being sentimental. "Think it over." Surprise, my number's on the card. When he left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching him walk down the street toward a waiting black SUV. Jerry came up behind me. "Prize, friend of yours?" "Not exactly," I said, sliding the card into my pocket. I didn't throw it away. Not yet. But that night, sitting at my kitchen table, I realized something. Surprise. Moving on might make sense on paper, but life isn't lived on paper. And roots, they don't grow if you keep pulling them up to see if they're worth something. The next morning, surprise, I gathered everyone before we opened. "We got an offer," I told them. "More than twice what we paid." The room went quiet, and I turned it down. Marla's smile came slow but steady. Surprise. Jerry let out a breath I didn't know he was holding. Ed just nodded like the decision had been obvious all along. Some places are worth more than their market value. Linda's porch was one of them. Surprise. The first bus rolled into East Oak Street on a Tuesday morning in June. It was painted a tired shade of blue, its windows streaked from an overnight rain. Surprise. And it carried 22 people with cameras hanging from their necks. I was unlocking the front door of Linda's porch when they stepped off, blinking in the summer sun. Surprise, they didn't look like locals. Sneakers too clean, sunglasses too expensive, voices too loud for this sleepy town. A woman in a straw hat broke from the group and came up to me. "Surprise? Is this the place?" she asked. That depends, I said. What place are you looking for? The workshop where the old man and his friends saved it from the bank, she said brightly. Prize. We saw it in the article. I didn't know there'd been an article, but judging from the way the rest of her group was already taking pictures of the sign, it had traveled farther than I imagined. Prize. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and coffee as usual, but the quiet hum of work was replaced by the rustle of strangers. Jerry paused mid-cut on the table saw. Marla looked up from her quilting frame. Prize. Needle frozen in midair. It wasn't that we didn't like visitors. We just weren't used to them coming in busloads. And this was only the beginning. By the second week of June, surprise, one bus had turned into 3. Then buses started coming on days we weren't expecting them, sometimes 2 in the same afternoon. The little front room of Linda's porch, Prize, built for a handful of locals at a time, now strained under the weight of 20-30 people crowding in to take photos, buy a souvenir, or just gawk. Jerry's woodworking corner, once a steady rhythm of saw and plane, became a performance space. Tourists leaned over his bench with their phones out, filming his hands while he worked. He didn't complain. Prize. But I saw the way his jaw tightened when someone asked if they could try cutting a piece for the photo. Marla's quilts, which had always sold slowly to people who knew the hours she put into them. Prize. Now vanished off the racks in minutes. Bought by strangers who didn't ask about the pattern story, just the price. And Ed's coffee stand, well, he was having the time of his life. Prize, chatting with visitors selling out before noon. But even he admitted it was getting harder to keep up. One Friday, a bus arrived before we even opened. Prize. I was still turning the key in the lock when a voice called out from the crowd. Is this where we can meet the old guy from the auction? They meant me. That day I didn't touch a tool. Prize. Didn't check an order, didn't sit down. I just smiled for photos and repeated the same story until my throat went dry. By closing time, my head was pounding. Prize. And as I looked around at the tired faces of Jerry, Marla, and even Ed, I knew we'd hit a breaking point. We'd saved Linda's porch from the bank. But could we save it from its own success? Prize. That Sunday evening after the last bus had gone and the shop was quiet again, I called everyone together around the old stove. The windows were open to the warm summer air, and the smell of sawdust mixed with honeysuckle drifting in from the alley. We can't keep doing it like this, I began. Not if we want this place to last. Jerry leaned back in his chair. Prize, rubbing his hands. What's the alternative? Turn people away? No, I said. We just need to decide how they come in and what they come in for. I laid out a plan. Prize, set open workshop hours. Mornings for our own work, afternoons for visitors. Guided tours twice a week so people could hear the real stories without interrupting the work. Prize, workshops for tourists at a set price. They could make a simple piece to take home, but they'd pay for the time and materials. Marla's eyebrows went up. So we turned the chaos into structure. Exactly, I said. We'll control the pace instead of letting it control us. Ed grinned. And I can start charging for the refill. We laughed. Prize. But it was the kind of ladder that comes when you know you've just figured out how to breathe again. The next week, we put the new system in place. Prize. And though a few visitors grumbled about having to wait for the tour, most stayed, and when they left, they'd actually listened, learned, and respected what they saw. Prize. Linda's porch was still open to the world, but now it was on our terms. By the end of summer, the buses still came, but we no longer dreaded their arrival. Surprise. The mornings belonged to us. The slow rhythm of tools, the comfort of routine, the quiet conversations that stitched our little family together. Afternoons brought the bustle. Prize, but it was a bustle we'd prepared for, with space for both their curiosity and our sanity. Prize. Jerry started keeping a story bench by his station, a finished piece of wood where visitors could sit while he worked, asking questions without hovering over his tools. Prize. Marla's quilts now came with handwritten cards about the history of each pattern, and more than once I saw people reading them aloud to their children. Its coffee stand turned into a small corner cafe. Prize, where locals and tourists actually sat together instead of rushing off. We didn't just survive the crowd. We shaped it into something that added to what we were. One evening after locking up Prize, I stood on the porch and watched the last bus turn the corner. The street was quiet again, the summer air heavy with the smell of warm cedar and cooling pavement. That's when it hit me. Prize. Success wasn't just keeping the doors open or selling more than last month. It was ending the day with the same people you started it with. Tired, maybe, but still glad to be here. It was early September. Prize. The kind of morning when the air feels crisp enough to wake you before the coffee does. I'd come in early to sort through an old oak desk we'd picked up from a church sale. Prize. The finish was worn smooth where hands had rested over the years, and the drawers groaned when you pulled them open. The bottom right drawer wouldn't close all the way. I knelt, surprised, thinking maybe a splinter had caught. Instead, my fingers brushed against something thin and folded, wedged deep at the back. I pulled it out. A yellowed envelope, edges curled, prize, sealed with a brittle flap that crumbled when I touched it. The handwriting across the front was steady but old-fashioned. To the one who finds this desk next. I stood there for a moment. Prize, the morning light spilling across the workbench, dust motes drifting in the air. Prize. There's something about finding a sealed letter that makes you feel like you've stumbled into a conversation you're not supposed to hear, and yet are meant to. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet, prize, written in careful cursive. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Not in the way of stepping out for the afternoon, but in the way we all go eventually. This desk was mine for 40 years. Prize, in the back office of Callahan & Sons Lumber. We built half this town from the boards we stacked, measured, and cut. Prize. But the best thing I ever built was not a house or a barn. It was the men and women who worked alongside me. If you found this desk, I hope you build something worth keeping too. Prize, and if you ever feel like giving up, remember, wood bends before it breaks. So do we. It was signed simply Thomas Callahan. Prize. I read it twice before the shop filled with the sound of Jerry's boots on the floor and the smell of Ed's coffee brewing. I knew this letter wasn't meant just for me. Prize. I waited until everyone was in before saying anything. Jerry was wiping sawdust from his bench, Marla had her sewing laid out, and Ed was fussing with the coffee grinder. Surprise. I found something this morning, I said, holding up the letter. In that oak desk from the church sale. They gathered around as I read it aloud. My voice sounded different in my own ears, slower, prize, heavier in the quiet that followed each line. When I finished, no one spoke for a moment. Marla was the first to break the silence. Prize. Thomas Callahan, my grandfather bought our barn wood from him, she said softly. That man knew his timber. Jerry nodded. I worked a summer at Callahan & Sons when I was 17. Prize learned more in 3 months than in the next 3 years. Leaned against the counter, mug in hand. Prize. 40 years at one desk, that's someone who understood what it means to stay. The letter felt like more than a relic. Prize, it was a challenge, the kind you can't ignore without feeling smaller for it. That afternoon, I pinned it to the pledge wall, not as a decoration but as a compass. Because even if Thomas Callahan was gone, prize, his words had found their way into the center of Linda's porch, and I had a feeling they were about to guide us somewhere we hadn't planned on going. 2 days later, a young man came into the shop. Prize. Couldn't have been more than 20, baseball cap turned backward, calloused hands that looked too young to have earned them. You Dennis? He asked. I nodded. He jerked a thumb toward the pledge wall. Prize. I saw that letter in the window. My granddad used to tell me about Thomas Callahan. Said he taught him how to use a plane without wasting a single curl of wood. He hesitated, then added, Surprise. I'm trying to get into carpentry. Hard to find anyone who'll take on an apprentice these days. Prize. Everyone wants you trained before they'll teach you anything. I looked at him. The kind of look that takes in more than just the words. He had the same restless energy I'd seen in myself at that age. Prize. Before I knew where to put it, that night, I brought the idea to Jerry, Marla, and Ed. What if we start an apprenticeship program? I asked. Not just for carpentry, for quilting, cabinet making, prize. Anything we know how to do. One teaching, just like it used to be. Call it the Callahan Apprenticeship in his honor. There was a beat of silence, then Jerry's slow smile. Prize. Guess we'd be building more than furniture, huh? Exactly. By the following month, the first 3 apprentices were already working alongside us. One at Jerry's bench, prize, one with Marla at the quilting frame, and one learning from me how to shape and finish a table leg until it felt like silk under the palm. The shop sounded different now. Prize. The steady rhythm of tools was still there, but it was joined by younger voices asking questions, laughing at their own mistakes, and celebrating small victories. A perfect joint cut, prize, a stitch that finally sat straight. The letter from Thomas Callahan stayed pinned to the wall, its edges curling a little more each week. Visitors would stop to read it, some quietly nodding, prize, some taking a picture. But for us, it wasn't just a piece of history. It was a daily reminder that the real measure of what we were building wasn't in the furniture or quilts that left the shop, prize. It was in the hands we sent out into the world, a little steadier, a little wiser, and carrying a piece of Linda's porch with them. And maybe years from now, prize, one of them would leave a letter for someone else to find. The first snow that year came early. Not the polite dusting that melts by noon, but a thick, heavy blanket that silenced the town overnight. Prize. When I stepped onto the porch that morning, the air was sharp enough to sting my lungs, and the boards under my boots groaned like they were waking from a long sleep. From the doorway of Linda's porch, Prize, I watched the street vanish into white. The maple in front wore its frost like armor, and the only sound was the slow, steady crackle from the stove inside. It felt like the world was holding its breath. Prize inside the shop was warm, the air rich with the smell of cedar and strong coffee. Jerry was already at his bench, though his movements were slower these days. Marla had a quilt stretched wide, Prize a winter pattern in deep blues and grays. Ed poured 2 mugs and handed me one without a word. Prize. Something about that morning felt different, like the start of a season you know will matter more than the ones before. Because deep down I knew this winter wouldn't be like the others. By late December, surprise, winter showed its teeth. The storm hit on a Thursday night, snow coming sideways, the wind howling so loud it rattled the old glass panes in their frames. The next morning, Prize East Oak Street was gone beneath drifts as high as the porch railing. No buses, no cars, no footsteps, just us. We decided to keep the shop open anyway, partly out of stubbornness, Prize, partly because it felt wrong to let the stove burn with no one around it. Jerry worked in near silence, the scrape of his plane the only steady sound. Surprise, Marla hummed under her breath while her needles slipped through fabric. Ed kept the coffee going like it was a lifeline. Around noon, the front door banged open. Prize. A rush of cold air swept in with a figure so covered in snow they looked carved from it. It was one of our apprentices, Ely, cheeks red, breath coming hard. "Power's out at my place," he said. Prize. Didn't know where else to go. We gave him coffee, a seat near the stove, and didn't ask why his voice cracked on those last words. By sunset, there were 6 of us gathered in the warm circle of light. Prize. No customers, no tours, just the hum of the stove and the sound of wind pressing against the walls. That night I realized Linda's porch wasn't just a place to work. Surprise, it was a shelter, in ways I hadn't seen until the storm stripped the world down to what really mattered. The storm lasted 3 more days. By the second night, we dragged in extra chairs, Prize, a mattress from the back storage, and whatever blankets we could spare. The apprentices stayed. Jerry didn't even go home, said his place was colder than the shop anyway. Prize, we cooked what we had on the wood stove, soup from canned vegetables, bread toasted on an iron pan, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Outside, the wind never stopped. But inside, Prize, the air was full of voices, telling stories, remembering summers, sharing the kind of truths that only come out when the world feels far away. On the last night of the storm, Eli spoke up. Prize. When I found you all, I was ready to quit. Everything. I didn't think I was good at anything. But you made room for me. Nobody said anything right away. Prize. Then Jerry reached over and patted his shoulder, slow and heavy. You stayed. That's the hard part. That night, lying on the mattress in the back. Prize. I knew this was the last winter I'd run Linda's porch. Not because I didn't love it, but because it was ready for someone else to carry. When the thaw finally came, it was like the world exhaled. Surprised, the snowbanks shrank, the street reappeared, and the first bus of spring rolled past the window. But I knew my season here was ending. I called everyone together one April afternoon. Prize, the air coming through the open door smelled of wet earth and sawdust. I'm stepping back, I told them. Prize. Not walking away, just letting new hands take the lead. Jerry looked at me like he'd been expecting it. Marla's eyes softened. Ed just grinned and said, Prize. Wes, I'm the old man now. I left them the keys, the ledger, and the letter from Thomas Callahan, still pinned to the pledge wall. And before I walked out, I turned the porch light on. Prize. Because that's what you do when you've built something worth keeping. You make sure it's lit for whoever comes next. That night, I didn't feel the ache of loss I thought I would. Prize. I felt the steady warmth of knowing the work would go on, shaped by the same hands that had once been shaped here. And maybe years from now, someone will find another letter in a drawer. Prize, they'll know. Someone before them left the light on. There are stories we tell because they are dramatic. Prize. And then there are stories we tell because they are true. The kind that leave a quiet echo long after the last word is spoken. What you've just heard isn't just about a father, a porch, or a storm. Prize. It's about the quiet, stubborn act of holding on to dignity when it would be easier to give it away. It's about the truth that love isn't always in the saying, yes. Sometimes it's in the hard. Prize. Necessary. No. If there is one thing I've learned in all my years, it is this: you cannot always choose the family you are born into, but you can choose the family you build along the way. And often, surprise, Those bonds, formed over sawdust, coffee, laughter, and the sharing of work, are every bit as strong as blood. So if you're listening to this and you've ever felt forgotten, taken for granted, prized, or left behind, hear me, you are not invisible. Your story matters, your voice matters, you matter. I want to thank you for walking with me through every season of this journey, for standing on this porch, prize, for feeling the sting of winter and the relief of spring, and for carrying these moments in your own heart. Now, I'd like to hear your story. Tell me in the comments, prize, what lesson has life taught you about family? Was there ever a moment when saying, no, was the most loving thing you could do? Share this story if you believe someone you know needs to hear it. Surprise. And if you haven't yet, join our family here at Dad's Last Revenge by subscribing, not just to watch, but to keep this porch light burning for everyone who needs a place to belong. Because in the end, surprise, the work we do on each other's hearts is the only thing that truly lasts.